welcome back. You're with Terry Erasmus, and today I'm going to be working on this Myrtle clump. It's a clump style. I bought it from a bonsai nursery a number of years ago, and I think I've got a couple of pictures of what it looked like when I first got it, and I'll put that, I'll overlay that onto the video. When I got it, it was in a plastic tub, and so I repotted it into this ceramic container, and I've just been feeding it for the last few years, trying to get it a bit stronger. And then also it has been wired a couple of times, but the focus was on on developing sacrificial branches in order to thicken up some of the branches that were growing from the trunk because they were very thin. So this is a typical hedge type of material that you'll find. It's actually a herb, a Myrtus communis, and certainly where I live in the Western Cape of South Africa, there are a lot of them that are used as clipped bushes in people's gardens. So it's quite common to find, or it's quite easy to find quite thick or mature material. In fact, in my garden, I've got quite a few of them that I actually grew from cutting. So they grow very fast, and there's a lot of nice characteristics about the species. It has very small leaves, it's got a very nice bark, and it produces a kind of a wart-like surface to the trunk or to the bark. Not the bark itself, but below the bark. So the actual wood of the tree produces these wart-like growths, which just adds a lot of interest to them. And I haven't seen too many, in fact, as bonsai. There are a few of them, typically much smaller trees. Very few that I've seen that are of this sort of size. And but that is in South Africa anyway. But in some of the European, particularly the countries around the Mediterranean, Spain, I believe, Portugal, where else have I seen them? Mainly Spain, I think. And they have some beautiful specimens, and they carve really well too. So today, my plan is just to thin out the tree. There's some weak inner growth. I'm going to clean that out. The branches that are thick enough, I will cut them back and seal those. And then probably, and then of course there's a lot of, it's very typical to get in a shrub-like plant, you always get these suckers, so clean that off, they'll be removed. I'll also maybe just put some wire onto some of the branches to basically position them, because we're still very much at a structural stage of development. And then I'll be getting a couple of, I've started stocking some of the samurai carving bits, in addition to the nibbler bits that we already stock. And so those will be arriving in the next couple of days, and I'd like to demonstrate some of them, the use of some of them on this tree, because there's a few stumps that were created when the tree was cut out of the hedge, I assume. And at the moment they are all just flat cuts. Some of them, it has started to callus on it, but now, while still in the structural development phase, would be a great time to do some carving. So I want to do some of that carving. That won't be in today's or in this episode, but I would like to prepare the tree for that. I think I will also take to this tree with a high pressure hose and clean it off thoroughly. There's a lot of algae, mossy growth on it. It's a bit dirty, and so I will clean that off using a high pressure water. And I think that probably about covers it. And of course, as usual, as I go through the tree doing the various, applying the various techniques, I will capture that on camera for you and just take you through my thought process on that. So it's important to remove this sucker growth because it takes away energy from the tree. And it's superfluous. You're not going to ever use it. So it's best just to remove it. This branch is now thickened up enough. It was allowed to develop as a sacrifice branch for probably 1 or 2 seasons, but now it can be cut back. And then one of the nice characteristics about the species is that it will break back on old wood. So new buds will form close to the cut, and then those will be used to continue with the structure of the tree. So I'm just using a branch cutter to eliminate that branch. You want to cut it a little bit longer than you probably will need, just to allow for some receding of the sap, and also just in case you don't get buds forming right at the end. And then it's also a good idea, obviously, now to seal this cut. So with the sacrifice branches having done their work, I've actually just pruned all of them down to an overall sort of imaginary profile. So what you're doing is you're building the tree from the inside out. So you grow it out to thicken up the base of the branches primarily, and then you're cutting it back, and then you're growing it out and you're cutting it back. Now initially it seems counterintuitive, because obviously you're trying to grow a bigger tree, and sometimes we can become slightly possessive of the growth. But it's very important to make these cuts and to be quite aggressive with them, because this is what's setting the foundation for the future ramification of the tree. So we're still, again, as I mentioned earlier on, working with the structural in the structural phase of development of this tree. And so now when you're looking at the length of material or branch that you want to keep and then make the cut, you need to be thinking about internodal distances, or your ramification needs to have, from the trunk itself, it will have a fairly long section before the branch would then ramify, and then each ramification or split or fork in the branch will have shorter and shorter and shorter distances between them. And this is very natural. If you look at trees out in the field or in a forest or somewhere, you'll find that closer to the trunk, it's very devoid, or there's this foliage or the branching is fairly sparse. And this is because on the interior of the tree, there would have been very little sunlight. So those branches would have become progressively weaker and died off. And it's only the branches on the outer regions of the tree that are able to survive because they're getting enough sun. So we need to emulate a similar thing in our bonsai trees. And this is why the internodes, or this distance before you start getting forking on the inside, is longer than what it is by the time it gets to the outline of the tree. If you make it too long, it's a bit of a problem as well, because the outline or the silhouette of the tree is going to be too far out, because it's going to be very difficult to then go from an extremely long internode or distance between ramification. It's going to be very difficult to gradually taper that off. If you are wanting the tree to be this size, then you need to start reducing that distance so that by the time you get to the outline, it makes sense, or it looks natural. And so it's very important to get those distances right if you get it. But with these trees, as I said, because they do break back on old wood very easily, you can get budding all along here. So these branches, as they've been cut here, are cut slightly long because I'm allowing a little bit of dieback in the branches, and then I can then hopefully get a lot of choices to make, a lot of branchlets or new buds to choose which I'm going to then allow to develop, and then I will make the final cut. So at this point in time, I will now continue. Just there's not much wiring because wire was already used on those sacrifice branches to give them a little bit of movement. And so they are set in place, so no more wires required on them. But there are some thinner branches that have developed subsequent to those primary branches, and I will put some wire onto that just to get away from, they're growing in a very straight fashion at the moment, so just to give them a little bit of movement, and so that will be the next step. When you're putting curves in with wire onto branches like this, which will be structural, you need to exaggerate the curves or the bends, because as this becomes thicker, those curves will become less pronounced or less exaggerated. And if your curves are too gentle, then by the time the branch has thickened up, you won't actually see them, and then it'll almost appear straight. So it will look a little bit odd. But in the beginning, when you're doing these structural branches, then you need to make sure that you put quite exaggerated bends onto them. I'm now going to rinse the tree off with a high pressure hose. And the reason for this is there's a lot of moss that's growing on the tree, and there's also, so it's discolored, there's a lot of dirt on the tree, and the pressure of the water is going to remove that. You could do it with a brush and just dipping that in water, but it obviously takes a lot longer. The other benefit to using high pressure is that if there's any bugs on the tree which is hiding underneath pieces of bark or just on the structure of the tree, you also remove that. Particularly with spider mites, that is a good thing to do. So now I'm going to be spraying it, and we get it nice and clean. Now you can see how the tree looks when it's cleaned. It almost looks like a different tree, in fact. All the moss has been removed and all the deposits from the trunk. But one of the things, the advantages, or one of the reasons for doing the cleaning that I forgot to mention earlier, is that with a clean trunk it's also easier, or clean branches and clean trunk, it's also easier for buds to actually form or to develop. So that it actually makes quite a substantial difference. So one of the benefits of cleaning is also that it'll help the growth of new shoots. Now that the tree has been cleaned off, the final step will be just to seal all these cuts, and the sealing them is obviously a means to protecting them, or you do it because you want to protect the growth, and protecting it from any kind of infection. And then also sealing the ends will prevent, or will reduce the amount of dieback that you have from those cut ends. So that's what I'm going to be doing now. The work for today is now completed, and just to do a quick recap, the idea was essentially to prepare the tree for the next step, which will be to carve these flat spots, the chops, on the tree that were made when the tree was dug out of the hedge or out of the ground some years ago. And now that the structural branches had thickened up sufficiently using sacrifice branch technique, I was able to cut them a lot shorter, and then I applied wire to some of the thinner branches just to give them some shape as well. And now that the structure or the canopy of the tree has been opened up a lot, it's now of course going to be a lot easier to get in with carving tools. We also cleaned the tree. There was a lot of deposits, mosses and dirt and an accumulation of organic material from the last couple of years, and so that was cleaned off with a high pressure sprayer. That will have hopefully sorted out any pests that are still that were sitting underneath the bark. Of course, the bark that was there is it's a very attractive feature of the tree, but this tree is still very young in its development, and so it will form new bark, and so I'm not too worried about that. But it also now exposes the with the bark removed, it's going to be a lot easier for the fissured bark, the bark plates that it started to fall off, which is where the pests can sit underneath. But it will also make it a lot easier now with that grime and that deposit, that accumulated grime removed, that you can get more budding on the tree as well. I wouldn't really want, barring a few positions, but I wouldn't really want too many new branches on the tree. I think the structure that I want is pretty much there, so where I want new growth forming is going to be more on the structural branching and not so much on the trunk. And then I sealed it with top gin sealer, and that's just to keep the tree from being infected with anything, and also just to help reduce the dieback, or not dieback, the sap from receding near those cut sites. And then, as I mentioned, in the next time I work on this tree will be to use various carving bits and to give some interest to the dead wood, because as this tree becomes more and more ramified and the canopy fuller, it's going to be increasingly more difficult to get in and do any carving work. So I hope that you've picked up some new tips, learned something from this, and if you haven't got a myrtle, it is a wonderful tree to work on, very rewarding, very hardy species to work on. And I think there is quite a fair amount of material growing in and around your area in gardens. So before you collect or dig somebody's tree out, be sure to ask them for permission. But you can get some really nice mature specimens to work on. So thanks very much for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. If you have, thank you very much, and I hope you're sharing these videos with your friends. Until next time, thanks very much for watching, and take care. Bye-bye.